What is up, basketball fans? Welcome to the NBA Outlet. I'm your host, Nick Fay. With me, as always, Kory Waldron, and regular guest on the show, Jac Manuell. What's up, fellas?
I think I'm going to let Kory say his outro. I don't want to be mean. I try and steal it every single time I jump on the outlet.
Yeah, well, maybe you'll steal somewhere else in the middle of the show.
Probably. Peace out, knuckleheads. There we go.
Fear the deer, right? Fear the deer.
Well, fear the deer. We are talking Bucks today, continuing the NBA Outlet preview series. And as always, you can find the previous previews on iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, OTGBasketball.com, Google Play, Dash Radio, and YouTube. But guys, before we talk about the Bucks of next season, we're going to talk about last year. 60-22, first in the Eastern Conference, lost in 6 games in the Eastern Conference Finals, and we're somewhat of a surprise. You know, there was hype for them going to the season, but not necessarily a number 1 seed type hype. How would you summarize last season in one emoji?
Yeah, I'm giving the bicep emoji. They flexed and dominated so many times throughout the regular season. Like you said, Nick, absolutely dominant display. Plus, Giannis entered the season just so damn swole.
True.
I went with the stock is rising emoji because once again we saw the Bucks take another step forward. Obviously, they made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. They were right on the cusp of making it to the finals. They just continue to get better and better, and Antetokounmpo himself continues to get better and better.
I went with the Grease flag because last year was all about Giannis, and like Jac mentioned, he kind of flexed going to the season, so it was all about him and his MVP type jump. I mean, I think it's easy to forget about where he was at going to the year. He was still really good, but last year he solidified himself as probably a top 5, top 3 player in the league. But what would you say is the biggest positive takeaway of last season for the Bucks?
Yeah, I've got a couple, so I don't know what Kory has. So I'm going to go with just Giannis' MVP. Just the massive takeaway. Giannis, solidified himself as probably the next face of the NBA when we see LeBron depart, and obviously if KD were to depart anytime soon. Giannis, obviously in the fan votes when it comes to the All-Star game, he's right up there when it comes to the likes of Stephen Curry, and I think he's overtaken Stephen Curry. And he's just a stud. And, he's still got so much room to improve. He's only 24 years old heading into his age 25 season. So we've got a decade of this. And Papa Giannis is going to be a fun thing to watch too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest positive takeaway has to be obviously Antetokounmpo. But, there was, like Jac mentioned, a lot of positives. I mean, Mike Budenholzer in his first year with the Milwaukee Bucks.
Had that one, yep.
Really took them to the next level, obviously winning 60 games. And then as well, like all of this, like this team in general, like Eric Bledsoe, Chris Middleton, Antetokounmpo, having George Hill, but he's already had the experience. But like all these guys getting that deep run playoff experience, that just matters. As a team continues to make the playoffs. I know last year they lost in the first round, or the year before they lost in the first round. So just seeing the team progress as a whole, Mike Budenholzer pushing this team forward, and as you mentioned, Jac, Antetokounmpo kind of solidifying himself as a top 5, top 3 player, continuing to elevate his own game and leading the charge. There wasn't anything. We'll get to the negatives, but there's just a ton of positives for this team last year because the Bucks again keep rising in the yearly power rankings. It feels.
And you guys nailed it. The 2 biggest positive takeaways were definitely Giannis, and then Coach Bud. I think he didn't get probably enough credit for what he did last year. Offensively, he changed what they did. Defensively, they were great. And then also just a shout out for my guy Brook Lopez, who was just a sniper from 3, had some monster
Splash
games.
Mountain.
Yeah,
Splash
and
Mountain.
Now we got 2 mountains in Milwaukee, which we'll talk about later, but biggest negative takeaway?
Yeah, I've got 2, and I'm going to guess that Kory might have one of these. So for me, it was Bledsoe underperforming yet again in the playoffs when it mattered most. Obviously, he got that contract extension towards the end of the season, and it seemed like a bit of a steal. But at the same time, he is on a good deal, but he fails to really step up when it matters. So for me, that was probably one of the bigger ones. If you have George Hill, your backup point guard, overperforming, your starting, a highly paid point guard, then that's not necessarily something you want. And for me, I was a little bit disappointed, maybe too strong of a word, but I'm going to go disappointed with the coaching of Bud throughout the playoffs, especially in how he was limiting Giannis's minutes. He had in 2016-17 and 17-18, he averaged 40-plus minutes per game throughout the postseason, and he only averaged just over 34 minutes in 2018-19. You want to play your stud players, your best players, the absolute guns, the superstars, Kawhi Leonard, LeBron James, Stephen Curry, 38 minutes plus when it matters. There's no tomorrow when it comes to the playoffs. So for me, I think that was one little blip on what was a pretty, outstanding season otherwise for Coach Bud.
Yeah, negative takeaway. Eric Bledsoe was definitely a negative. Obviously, he earned the extension in the regular season. I mean, Eric Bledsoe is a proven point guard, a very good defensive point guard, but we saw a lot of his flaws on full display in the playoffs once again. A guy who shot 41% from the field, 23% from three. At times couldn't even be played because of how bad his offense was. And obviously another negative that comes with the fact that they re-signed Bledsoe is that they couldn't re-sign Malcolm Brogdon. So the negative is because you re-signed Bledsoe, you also had to let go of Brogdon. And then also just like a negative in general, like Chris Middleton wasn't very good in the playoffs last year. Shot 41%. Him being the number 2 guy to Antetokounmpo, you really saw just some of the issues with the Bucks offense when it came to the playoffs, because it feels like if you limit Antetokounmpo, the rest of the guys don't really know what to do at times, it felt like. Not that I don't think Middleton's like a scrub by any means, but Antetokounmpo just really makes that offense go. He's obviously the main facilitator, and the guys around him just kind of lose their way when he gets kind of limited. So that was probably the biggest negative. And then you could also say a negative was like Nikola Mirotic. Like, obviously they brought him in, and he was just a complete bust. Injuries play a little bit of a factor there. And then I could even mention like Pau Gasol. It was a nice swing move, but he didn't even get to play in the playoffs.
Yeah, I really like the point you made about Bledsoe and impacting Malcolm Brogdon's contract, because if they don't extend him, they probably are able to keep Malcolm Brogdon. And I think we'd all agree you'd probably rather have Brogdon over Bledsoe at this point, at least from what we've seen, especially offensively, and how he complements Giannis. And nice point about Middleton too, Kory, because Middleton did a really good job on Kawhi, but it was like he was exerting so much energy defensively, he didn't have enough in the tank offensively. And obviously from your great players, when it comes to the playoffs, you kind of want them to perform. So I think there are definitely some big issues. And then obviously just Bledsoe's performance. And just to touch on Jac's point, I want to say Giannis's numbers were probably average minute-wise because of that Pistons series. I'm sure he probably played in some like 20-minute marks because that series was so bad.
True, but I think that there was, even throughout the latter points, and I'll have to look through the game logs, but I remember listening to a lot of podcasts, and a lot of people were savage in ways and savage in the rankings and analysis of Bud not sort of really riding his guys. And I still think that for the most part, yes, if the Detroit series was a bit more competitive, those numbers might have been 36, 37 minutes, but I'd be remiss to look. I might take a quick look while we're going through the rankings and stuff. How many times Giannis played 40-plus minutes when it really mattered across the postseason? In fact, yeah.
I got it for you. Again, the Toronto series, because all the other series obviously didn't matter. They killed Boston, they killed Detroit. So against Toronto, game 1, 37 minutes, they won by 8. Game 2, 34 minutes because they won by 22, so obviously probably didn't have to play. Game 3, 44 minutes. Game 4, 34 minutes, game 5, 39 minutes, and game 6, 40 minutes.
So it's just that game 4 aberration of 34 minutes,
and they were blown out in that game.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it's fair. When you look at it.
I think like Giannis is young enough where you almost could play him. Not to say you want to play anybody the entire game, but you definitely could give him a couple more minutes here.
If RJ Barrett can do it, then I think Giannis can do it.
All right, but talking rankings, our staff has the Bucks coming in at number 2. Is this fair, too high, or too low?
I think the Bucks could be the number 1 team when we're talking about the regular season. I think that they could be better than the Los Angeles Clippers. I think the Clippers have probably the best claim for championship favoritism. But the Bucks are very close, and obviously being in a weaker conference in the East, and they just seem to do so well throughout the regular season. They have a relatively deep rotation, despite the fact that they did lose Brogdon. Mirotic is gone. They've added some nice pieces in Korver and Matthews that we'll get to later on. So I think the Bucks could be number 1, but I don't think they'll be any lower than a 3 or a 4. It's them or the Sixers in the East. And for me right now, I'd give the slight edge to the Bucks.
I think 2 is fair. I actually think 2 is almost perfect. You lose Malcolm Brogdon. Now we do know that Eric Bledsoe is going to miss some time to start the year with an injury. You do have some new pieces in. So I think 2 is fair. But like you mentioned, Jac, if the Clippers are like resting guys, for example, or the Lakers are resting guys, and I think it's very easy the Bucks do get number 1. I just think they may have taken like a slight step back.
Yeah, I think one thing they have on their side is they're bringing a majority of the same roster. So number two, I think is fine. I think they're definitely the best team in the East, but there's an argument for the Clippers. I would probably expect them to have maybe the best regular season record. Obviously, playing in the East, the Western Conference teams are going to rest guys more, and they're going to have to deal with a tough team every night, where there's going to be easier matchups in the East. So one or two is fine for me for Milwaukee. Now, moving on to the offseason, no draft picks, but players in: Wesley Matthews, Kyle Korver, Robin Lopez, Frank Mason, Dragon Bender, Giannis Antetokounmpo. Thoughts on these guys?
Yeah, I saw the other night the Robin Lopez and Brook Lopez combination at its finest. I mean, there's going to be so much amazing content on Twitter and every other social media platform. But these moves around the wings are solid moves. You know, Dragon Bender, I think, is worth a flyer. I don't think he's going to necessarily crack the rotation at the early point of the season. But, you know, he's a former lottery pick. And, you know, in a successful system under the guise of Mike Budenholzer, who is known to develop players at a really nice rate, they could see a little bit of a pop out of him. He could get a few minutes if there's some injuries to Brolo and Robin throughout the season. I think Kyle Korver is just the perfect sort of piece, the perfect sniper from the perimeter that they need to really give them some pop from the perimeter. They've always had really good three-point shooters, but not an elite three-point shooter in the likes of a Kyle Korver or a Joe Harris or a JJ sort of Redick. So Kyle Korver is going to give them plenty. He does seem to fade throughout the postseason at times. So obviously the regular season is where you will see probably the best of him. And Wesley Matthews, getting him for the minimum. I don't understand how other teams are so low on Wesley Matthews. I think that he still has at least a season or two left in him at a solid NBA rate. I don't necessarily think he's going to have his heyday that he did in Portland or even, you know, into the early points of Dallas. But I think he's just a prototypical sort of wing that I think at a position of need that a lot of other teams should have been looking at. And the losses I don't think were that big of a deal outside of Malcolm Brogdon.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hate getting Robin Lopez. Robin Lopez, Brook Lopez, as you mentioned, Jack, will be fun content. Robin Lopez hit a three the other night in preseason. He did his tea celebration. I wasn't aware that he does the little tea celebration, sipping the tea. I think that's kind of fun. Now he might have the double Splash Mountain Peaks or something. I don't know, however we want to make the new nickname. But I think that's interesting because, you lose Mirotic and you didn't bring back Pau Gasol. So now Robin Lopez gets that backup center role. And then Wesley Matthews, Kyle Korver, bringing in both those guys, you're hoping that both those guys combined can give you similar to what Malcolm Brogdon gives you. Like a 2-for-1 type of thing, because obviously Kyle Korver is the three-point shooter marksman, even though I just don't see Kyle Korver being that useful in year 17. I think, for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, he can give you something, but defensively, this is a guy now who will actually get abused on the defensive end. Obviously, the Bucks are a good defensive team, so you can probably hide him in certain schemes. And then Wesley Matthews, there probably wasn't a giant market for Wesley Matthews, because if anyone watched him in the playoffs last year, he lost the Pacers 2 games by himself. He's a very good defender. He plays with a ton of heart, a ton of grit, gives up his body. The offense is the issue. Some questionable IQ moments. Can't really stay consistent shooting-wise anymore. Obviously, when he tore his Achilles that final year in Portland, he definitely lost some off of his game. But again, this is a steady player who can definitely fit in around the likes of Bledsoe, Middleton, Antetokounmpo, because again, Matthews isn't going to be asked to do too much. He's going to be asked to take wide open looks for the most part from three and play good defense, which is what I think Matthews can still give you at this point of his career. So I think it's a solid move to try and replace what Brogdon gave you, but at the same time, I think they came up short with actually finding someone who can truly replace what I think Brogdon gave this team. And I know some Milwaukee Bucks guys just aren't that high on Brogdon, and I just don't get it, because even through 2 games in the preseason for the Pacers, everything I've seen from Brogdon is great. But yeah, I think Matthews was a solid signing for what they lost.
At that price too, and I think considering their options, they're pretty much capped out. They didn't really have a lot of room to make big signings. So I think Matthews, like you mentioned, being like a 5th option, possibly if he starts, or a guy that comes off the bench. And I think you're hoping with Kyle Korver, maybe he can just teach Giannis a thing about shooting. And I'm not going to lie, I'm super pumped to watch Robin and Brook win. If they win a championship together, I think I'd be super excited, because it'd be the first time they're nice to each other. But talking departures, we mentioned Brogdon, Tim Frazier, Nicole Mirotic, Pau Gasol, Tony Snell. Obviously, they wish they could retain Brogdon, but any of the other guys you think they wish they could bring back?
I mean, Snell's at a position of need, but he really didn't provide anything for them. I think that there was one point of the season, the meme going around was the Tony Snell performance where he literally put up nothing in like 20 minutes, no box score contribution at all. So I don't think Tony Snell's that big of a loss, but I think he'll be okay in Detroit, as you guys alluded to in the Detroit preview. But yeah, I think outside of Brogdon, how much? I'll pose a question to you guys. How much of a loss is Brogdon, and do you think that the departure of Brogdon could signal a departure of Giannis? Like, if you were the front office in Milwaukee, would you have gone into the luxury tax, or would you have been okay with having guys like George Hill and like sort of Kory said, hoping that Kyle Korver and Wesley Matthews can give you some combined sort of contribution that at least somewhat similar to what a Brogdon could give you?
I think losing Brogdon is the first crack in possibly losing Antetokounmpo. Because I think losing Brogdon is okay if Eric Bledsoe performs like his contract's worth. If we get another playoff performance like last year from Eric Bledsoe, then that screams just major issue for me. Because now we're looking at Antetokounmpo maybe looking around at his supporting cast, knowing he's got Bledsoe and Middleton long-term as his running mates, and thinking, I wish Brogdon was there instead of Bledsoe. I even kind of play with the idea in my head of what if the Bucks tried to what would have happened if the Bucks traded Bledsoe in the offseason to try and make room for Brogdon even. But that's an
excellent point, Kory. And I'm sorry to cut you off, but I just don't want to lose this point is that when you're in a situation like this and you're not going to have cap moving forward, you have to retain the player because you need to have good players so you can make a trade. Maybe you don't trade Bledsoe and you end up trading Brogdon, but now you just lose essentially an asset for nothing because he was a restricted free agent.
Right. So that, I think there's definitely cracks in the lining. Obviously, Antetokounmpo not signing the extension or not really wanting to talk about the extension. Not that that's anything new. I think with how the cap continues to raise, you're not going to want to sign a deal until you really have to get the most money. And, most players nowadays are smart with that. But I think there's definitely some concern because, Bledsoe just hasn't been in the playoffs. And I think that matters.
And just a note, they did receive picks, I believe, in the Brogdon sign-in trade, but I think he's a guy you'd rather have, and then you'd probably rather move a guy like Eric Bledsoe or just have the option because you never know who's going to come on the table. Maybe there's a move out there for you to grab Bradley Beal. Malcolm Brogdon is an enticing piece for a team like the Wizards. So I agree with what Kory said. I think they should have made the move and just push forward with it and then worry about the cap later on in the season when the luxury tax comes. You need to make sure you have a championship-level team, especially if you're worried about losing Giannis. Obviously, they probably seem a little bit confident, but hey, you don't win a championship and let's say Philadelphia beats you this year and then next season the Nets are full strength and all of a sudden you just lost your window.
And I think luxury tax is literally
it feels like this might be their
window, yeah?
No.
I think the luxury tax, platform and what it is supposed to be for is for those teams that have aspirations and want to really sort of go all in. The one thing that, there were plenty of criticisms and are plenty of criticisms about Dan Gilbert, but when Cleveland were competing, he would go into the luxury tax because he knew it meant having a more competitive product for LeBron James and to get them in the postseason when it really mattered and to really go all out for it and, give the likes of David Griffin and Kobe Altman the capabilities to build a real championship contender. If you had Malcolm Brogdon right now in the Milwaukee Bucks, I think that we would be talking about the Bucks in the likes of the Los Angeles Clippers as a 1-2, probably rivaling each other and probably almost a fait accompli. Yeah, this is going to be the finals we're talking about. It's going to be Milwaukee. It's going to be the Clippers. But because of what the moves the Sixers have made, I think that if you are a billionaire owner of a basketball team, then what is a few $1 million if you want to have a championship? Like, what is the point of not going all in and not winning a championship when you have those capabilities and it just costs a few extra bucks when you've already got hundreds of millions already in your pocket?
Right.
And I always think about it. Oh, go ahead, Kory.
Go ahead. No, finish your point. My point.
I want to say when you're successful too, your revenue is higher. like you're just going to be a more relevant team. You know, the Bucks obviously 5 years ago before Giannis popped off, they weren't really talked about. They weren't making sales. Now it's a big deal in Milwaukee. Like obviously it was dominated by the Packers, but now the Bucks are coming on the scene and they have one of the best players in the NBA. You want to make sure you capitalize. And I think we've kind of hinted at it. Philadelphia has a chance to beat them this year. Brooklyn has a chance moving forward. So it's like they no longer are locked up of being probably the best team in the East moving forward, where they have to compete with other contenders, and maybe they lost a chance at the window, and maybe Philadelphia and Brooklyn will be better than them next season.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Like we in the NBA in particular, title windows vary, and they just seem to close very quickly. Like the Rockets, for example, you know, their title window was like 2 years or like a year and a half, even technically. And the Bucks, like as you mentioned, when the Nets are full strength next year, and then you know, obviously they're not the Pacers. I think are going to be the same level. Like when the Pacers are fully healthy as well, if they reach expectation, and the Philadelphia 76ers have their young core still, like the title window looks like last year and this year looks like the real title window chances for the Bucks. And then moving forward, that title window just looks a lot more foggy and blurry than it did, you know, this year going in.
And then you also look at the Bucks as they're not necessarily filled with young talent. Obviously, Giannis has another level of hit, but you look at the rest of the roster, there's not guys who are like, oh, this guy's going to take the next step and he's going to be an all-star. Where you look at Philadelphia and Brooklyn and Indiana, there's a lot of guys in those teams that can improve substantially.
And Boston and Toronto
and Boston
as well.
Yeah, I'm not really going to throw Toronto in there, but I'll throw Boston in there because
I think the reason why I throw Toronto in there is because of the move that they made with Kyle Lowry that you guys have chatted about before, and the flexibility that it gives them to pursue a guy like Giannis in 2021 free agency. You know, obviously there are ties somewhat with the NBA Africa, and you know, Giannis's parents are Nigerian. You know, Masai Ujiri is Nigerian, so there's that connection there. I wouldn't be surprised if Toronto Raptors are in the sweepstakes for a guy like Giannis. He doesn't seem to me like a guy who is all about the glitz and the glam and is just drawn to LA and to New York like an Anthony Davis would be. I think that the Raptors are sneaky in the race for him, so that's why I have them in there. And you have that and Pascal Siakam, that's a championship contender.
And they also might have, you know, obviously they're going to have to deal with Siakam's extension, but they'll also, I think, have some other money and maybe a possibility of bringing another guy in. So I think they're definitely a threat in terms of free agency. And just to throw Boston back in there, the young talent, and they also could still make a move for somebody to kind of boost up that roster. So it's the East, it'll squeeze real quick.
It certainly will. And, you know, the Bulls are on the rise. It's just, like Kory mentioned, I think in today's NBA, and we've sort of talked about that, the championship windows are smaller than ever. It's not the 90s where the Chicago Bulls and you've got like 5-6 years, or the heydays of the Lakers and the Celtics. You know, the system that the NBA has right now with the draft and the salary cap is to provide an element of parity so all teams can be somewhat successful. Yes, it does take good management, good coaching, and good player development, but for the most part, we're seeing these teams sort of jockey for position. And, you know, who knows how long this window will last in Milwaukee, but like Kory said, I don't think it's going to last very long.
Yeah, and I mean, the Bucks should probably try to push forward with a move this season in terms of like adding more talent, but I'm pretty sure they don't have many picks moving forward because of some of the other moves they made in the past.
Have you guys heard the rumor about the Bucks being in the Chris Paul sweepstakes?
If it got through to Eric Bledsoe.
I did hear that, but again, like that's like someone we want to have to take Eric Bledsoe. Like, does OKC want Eric Bledsoe going forward? No. Like, and what does Milwaukee have to offer aside from cap relief for Chris Paul? Like, because if you're OKC, you're giving up Chris Paul for Eric Bledsoe. Do you want Eric Bledsoe for the next couple of years? Like, maybe for like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's less money though. That's the only thing.
That's true. I mean, it's a lot less money. I mean, that's the one good thing about Eric Bledsoe too. Not that I think, you know, he's bad. I do like Eric Bledsoe. Like, the contract's not bad. Like, it's a pretty friendly contract when you're taking it like some of the other main big point guards in the league. So I guess, yeah, you're right, Nick. If they want cap relief, then I guess Eric Bledsoe isn't a terrible guy, at least going forward, because you can probably then flip Bledsoe again, right, if he raises his stock in OKC.
It's possible. And I believe, I want to say the last year of Eric Bledsoe's contract is non-guaranteed or partially guaranteed. And it's an interesting contract. It's 15 this year, 16 next year, 18 the following, and 19 in the last year, which I believe is partially guaranteed. It's an ascending contract, which would actually make it a lot more difficult to trade for Chris Paul, because Chris Paul is close to $40 million for a cap hit. And it's not like the Bucks are filled with a ton of big contracts. They'd essentially probably have to move like a couple guys to get to that number.
Yeah, and I think obviously Chris Paul's going to be the one that most people are talking about. But for me, when that rumor came up, I was just like, why not just pay Malcolm Brogdon? Like,
True.
why even be in these rumors in the first place? Because Malcolm Brogdon is just the perfect piece and was the second best player on the Bucks during their postseason run. Kory and I have ranked Chris Middleton 25th in our top 50 ranking. Got a little bit of heat for that, but we provided reasoning, and the article will be dropping soon on his byline as well. So you need Chris Middleton to be the number 2 guy now. He needs to get back to 2017-18 when they had that series against Boston. He was the best player, and if he can get back, he was insane. If he can get back to that, then I think that the Milwaukee Bucks are in a fine position. And like Kory said, Bledsoe needs to at least produce somewhat in the postseason, because we know he can do it in the regular season. We know he's got talent. We know he's an incredible defender. He can hit the 3-ball. He fits Milwaukee's and Coach Bud's system perfectly. He just needs to step up when it matters, and Malcolm Brogdon did. He's a 50-40-90 guy who can pass the ball and can just fit perfectly as a star role player, as like Tristan Thompson likes to say. So, the Bucks are in a good position, but also in a slightly precarious position in terms of their championship hopes.
Do you guys think they could make a move for Kevin Love this year?
I think that they're in a position to, but I think that there would be other teams that he would provide more value to. Kevin Love in the preseasons looked okay. I've jumped on the bandwagon. When I was on the Blazers pod, I'm always about him and getting him to Portland. I've been on that bandwagon for maybe a year or two now, and I think it makes the most sense for as a third sort of star, complementary star. I think Kevin Love would fit in the offensive system of Milwaukee quite nicely, but Milwaukee do also have an incredibly good defensive system and ask a lot of their players on that end of the floor. And I think Kevin Love is subpar at best as a defender, so I think he would fit better in a Portland Trailblazers system. And I don't know how much Kevin Love would make the Bucks better, but I think he would elevate the Blazers and some other teams in a more pronounced fashion.
I think it's an interesting idea, but I lean with Jack. I wouldn't go all in for Kevin Love. I don't think Kevin Love. If you get Kevin Love in the Bucks, I'm not thinking like, oh my God, like this is now the contending move. Like this is the move. This pushes them over the top. Like I think it adds more offense, but then you're losing defense. I mean, granted, Antetokounmpo can play the 5, so you have like a really interesting lineup of like Antetokounmpo at the 5, Kevin Love at the 4, Middleton at the 3, and then obviously I think Bledsoe probably gets dealt in that deal. So then like you're using George Hill and DiVincenzo or Wesley Matthews. I think it's interesting, but I don't think it raises the bar. And also, like, if I'm a truly contending team, like a Bucks, Sixers, and obviously the Sixers aren't going to go after Kevin Love, but I'm not taking the risk on a guy who can't stay healthy. Like, that's just me. Like, if I'm seriously thinking that I can win a title this year, I'm just not taking the risk on Kevin Love's health unless he proves to me this year that he can stay healthy for a long period of time.
Yeah, I think health is a big factor for Love, or whoever trades for him. That's a really good point, too, and this is what kind of intrigued the idea is because playing with a player like Giannis would allow Kevin Love to be hidden a little bit more because Giannis could essentially guard every position. But obviously, he's not the biggest game changer, but the thing is, he would be a guy they could get that wouldn't necessarily take a lot of assets, where that's their problem is they don't really have many things to trade to improve this roster if for some reason they feel they're behind or they're evened up with Philly and going to that series, Philadelphia might have the edge. But moving on more into the season, what would be the biggest team X factor for the Bucks, non-player and non-health?
Yeah, for me, and I'm not sure if this counts as player or health or whatever it might be, but it's the contractual status of Giannis. I think it's the biggest storyline lingering over this Bucks team, and it's begun already. It begun last season. It's going to become more fervent, more pronounced, even more of a storyline heading into this season, into next season, into the playoffs. Giannis has already addressed it. Giannis as a superstar and his personality seems to me, like I sort of mentioned earlier in relation to where he would want to go possibly. He seems like a loyal guy, but loyalty only gets you so far in a business that's about championships. And Giannis wants that chip, and if Milwaukee can't give it to him, he's going to move on. And they've given him a decent enough opportunity. We've spoken about the Malcolm Brogdon thing. So that for me is going to be almost the number one storyline throughout this entire season. How I think Giannis as well has a at times frosty and testy relationship with certain media members out in Milwaukee. He can be. We saw the fun-loving sort of smoothie guy, and what was it, the blowjob button thing that he got for like when he was doing a live Instagram, like the sort of fun-loving, goofy Giannis. I don't think that guy's there anymore. I think he's sort of like this hyper-focused, hyper-elite, hyper-competitive sort of dude, and he doesn't really care about media commitments and that sort of thing. So I think it's the circus surrounding the contract of one of the game's best players.
So I mean, I have like two. One, obviously, we said players. We said no player. Like, so the supporting cast for me is still an X factor. Because we saw last year what can happen when the supporting cast kind of takes a step back. But more or less for me, the X factor is Mike Budenholzer. We know Budenholzer is a very good coach. We know that he had that 60-win season with the Atlanta Hawks a couple years ago. They lost out to LeBron. He had the 60-win season last year, but he hasn't had a ton of playoff success. Jack even alluded to it before. Some of the rotations, some of the game plans he had in the playoffs were questionable at times. So can Budenholzer put together not just a great regular season, but a good postseason run that really pushes this Bucks team to actually compete and get them to the NBA Finals and hopefully get the title?
Both excellent points. And I just went with, how are the Bucks going to be better than last season? How are they going to improve? We talked a lot about losing Brogdon, how that's going to have a negative impact. Where else on their roster can they get better and take another step this year to get to the NBA Finals? But what's the starting lineup on opening night?
With that, Nick, I'll make a counterpoint. Do they even have to be better? Because the teams that they're really competing against, it's not necessarily, obviously, the Sixers are the most well-equipped with, the defensive capabilities to, Al Horford, the Giannis stopper, and Joel Embiid, one of the best defenders in the league. Outside of that, there is no real reason outside of the development of Giannis that I think the Bucks necessarily will be better. Maybe we can see Middleton and Bledsoe, and I think we'll speak about player X factors and stuff. Those are guys we might address, but Middleton and Bledsoe, how they improve is going to have to be, because we know Giannis is still growing. We know his three-pointer, all the rest. He seems confident with it. He's shot it okay this preseason as well. I don't necessarily see internally as a cohesive unit this Bucks team being better than last year's Bucks team as a whole, at least in the regular season.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the point, because maybe they'll have an easier time with Philly than Toronto, but they're still going to have to probably beat either the Clippers or the Lakers, which you would probably say are the same level as Toronto or maybe higher with the Clippers with that team they have. So I think maybe not as much as, the regular season, but how are they going to be better in the playoffs? How are they going to take another step? And is it just going to be Giannis taking another level as a player, or is it the other guys you mentioned? Is it Bledsoe and Middleton being better, or is it Coach Bud, putting together a better game plan to adjust to what the opponents are doing? So I think there needs to be some type of improvement, majority in the postseason. Obviously, regular season doesn't matter. As long as you're in the playoffs and you get home court, you're in pretty good shape. But starting lineup on opening night.
Yeah, starting lineup, George Hill, Wesley Matthews, Chris Middleton, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Brook Lopez.
Same for me. And obviously, if Bledsoe was healthy, he'd be starting.
Yep, same over here. Now, who's the player to watch for Milwaukee?
Yeah, I'm sure Kory will just take the other player, who I don't say out of the two that I sort of alluded to earlier, but it's Eric Bledsoe. We've spoken about him at length. We don't necessarily need to add too much more, but if he can step up when it matters, then the Milwaukee Bucks can win a championship.
For me, it is Chris Middleton, the number two, the Robin to Antetokounmpo's Batman, an all-star last season. You need a clear-cut number two, and you need your number two to be just as good in the playoffs to win, especially in today's kind of like league of duos. The duo of this team is Antetokounmpo and Middleton. Middleton was good last year, but definitely took a step back from the year prior despite being an all-star, in my opinion. The three-point numbers were up, but he's just got to become a more prominent scorer. He's got to be able to be more effective in the playoffs. He just has to elevate his game to another level. And obviously, Bledsoe, it goes without saying he needs to be better as well.
And I think maybe one positive for Middleton, I know the fit into Bud's system wasn't exactly perfect last year, and there was games where I think he was benched, and it just wasn't overall a smooth transition. So maybe this summer he can kind of pop off. But do you guys think Chris Middleton's good enough to be the second best player in a championship team?
I think he is when you have a number one as good as Giannis is. And I think that we forget, especially when someone is as good and as dominant as like the elite superstars, the Kawhi Leonards, the LeBron James, Stephen Currys, you don't necessarily need to have, a Miami trio with Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, and the like. I think Kory and I might be a little bit higher on Chris Middleton than the rest of the NBA public, But I also remember, like I sort of alluded to earlier, what he did in the 2017-18 postseason. It's not like he's gotten worse as a player. It's just that he failed to produce in the 2018-19 playoffs. And I thought he had a really good regular season. I think his skill set is almost, if you're looking for the prototypical player that you would want to draft for any team as a sort of second, third star, Chris Middleton has all of those skills. He can shoot the three ball, he can hit from mid-range, he can create his own shot, and he can play very capable defense. He doesn't have to have the ball in his hands, every single possession to be effective either. So for me, I think Chris Middleton, I'm still high on him compared to probably a large majority of the NBA public. Maybe the playoffs left a sour taste in their mouths, but I have a more holistic view and a more balanced view just because I know what he can do, and I think that he can get back to that. I don't think there's any reason why he can't be as forceful and as impactful as he was, just 2 seasons ago.
So I think he can be your clear-cut number 2. I think he can be the best player at number 2. Jack, you made a good point. Like, Antetokounmpo is your star. Enough said, almost to a degree. I think more so you need to have a really clear-cut third best player. Yeah. And I'm not so sure I know who the third best player on this team is going into the season.
It was Brogdon.
Right. It was clearly like a toss-up between Brogdon and Middleton for the number 2 best, number 3 best. Now losing that, Brook Lopez, Bledsoe, you can even make an honorable mention, maybe even Wesley Matthews being the third best player, depending on the night, if Bledsoe's not being effective from deep. So that for me is the biggest question mark. I'm not so worried about Middleton being the second best player on a title contending team.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you need Bledsoe to be that third best player. I don't think you can really expect that from Brook Lopez at this point, and he's limited in certain ways on the court. So Bledsoe just needs to be better, and I think mainly a lot of that is just a three-point shot being consistent. But what's a worst-case scenario for the Bucks?
Yeah, I think the worst-case scenario is we see an Anthony Davis sort of situation, and Giannis expresses some discontent. We could see him, request a trade from Milwaukee and. Something, one of the biggest stories in NBA could happen again, and we see a superstar, force his way out of a team that has aspirations that are higher, that are quite high. But for me, I guess it's almost championship or bust for this team. So if they don't win a championship, it doesn't necessarily matter how bad the season is. It's a failed season. If you are Milwaukee, if you are Philadelphia, if you are the Lakers, maybe even like a Utah or a Denver team or Houston, it's a bust season, because at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. It doesn't necessarily matter how many wins you get in the regular season, or if you lose in the first round or the second round. If you don't get that chip at the end of the day, it's a worst case scenario bust season for me.
I was hoping for a second you weren't going to say that so I could have my own talking point. But yeah, the worst case scenario is anything short of the NBA Finals. I don't even think necessarily worst case scenario is not winning a title. I think if you don't get better than you were last year, which is the NBA Finals, it's a losing season for me. You want to keep progressing, and we mentioned this already with the title windows. The window's now. If they don't make it to the NBA Finals, it's a losing season.
Yeah, I like that too. I think obviously you want to win the championship, but if you can at least make progress and get to the finals and have a competitive series, that'll probably leave Giannis with a positive taste in his mouth. Do you guys think if they don't get to the finals that Giannis could request a trade this summer?
I certainly think it's possible. I'm not really great at forecasting that far ahead, but if they need to, I think Kory made a pretty salient sort of point. They need to improve at least. They need to show some level of improvement, even if somehow there are injuries and they show steady progress and they're still at a championship level. Then I think Giannis is one of those guys that is more likely to stay and doesn't crave the bright lights of other cities, or is going to be as tempted as some other NBA players in today's day and age. So I think that they just plain and simple need to show improvement and win another series and get a few games more. And I think that they're in a good position to do so. They might need to, I think there'll be a team in the buyout market that I think need to, and in the trade deadline, all the really competitive teams really need to be active there. I think the Bucks have a really good chance, and I think they can really add to their roster. I don't think any team right now is, as much as when we do the preview series, we have to assess it as it is. But if we were to do the preview series in February 14, it would be a completely different ballgame, because how much sometimes the buyout guys can really affect the team, or even not affect other teams because they didn't get them. So purely and simply, if the Bucks were to get a guy on the buyout market and the Clippers were after him as well, like who gets Andre Iguodala, all these little things can have a real impact. The moves on the margins, when you're going for the highest glory, every little move matters.
I don't really see any scenario unless they get bounced in like the first round in which Antetokounmpo says I want out. As long as they're at least in the Eastern Conference Finals, I think he'll at least give them another year. I just don't see him pulling the trigger that fast. Antetokounmpo just doesn't give me that kind of vibe that he would just give up on the team that quick. As long as they remain at the same level they were last year, I don't see him getting angry. It's if they, second round exit even, if they take a step backwards from last year, then I could see him maybe getting angry, but I don't see him demanding a trade just yet.
Yeah, as long as they maintain being contenders, I think he'll be happy. But what's your actual prediction for the season, and where do they finish in the division?
They're first in the division, and I'm giving them 59 wins on the regular season.
I have them winning 60 games. I have them being the best in the Central Division, and I have them making the Eastern Conference Finals. And again, I haven't locked in final predictions yet.
Yeah, I got 60 wins, first in the Central, and I'll lock them in for the NBA Finals.
Yeah, I would probably lean towards them a little bit too, but
like you said, everything can change in February.
It certainly can, but I think when we're comparing the Sixers to the Bucks, the reason why I go with the Bucks is because I think that they have a lower combustibility rating than the likes of the Sixers do, whereas I think the Sixers have this tremendous upside with all the talent that they have. They lack depth, which I think the Bucks do have, and certainly helps in the regular season. But the Sixers could be something special as both a regular season and a playoff team. They could just dominate in ways that we haven't seen in the modern NBA. So for me, that's what you're assessing. Like, what do you buy into more? Are you taking that risk with the Philadelphia 76ers and all the ridiculous amount of talent they have in that starting five? Or do you go with the tried and true of what you know? We know what the Milwaukee Bucks are. We've spoken about them at length. They've made some moves around the wings, but we know what they are as a system. We know that they are on both ends of the floor. We know who they're led by in, an MVP, a young stud. There are going to be changes, but I don't think that the Bucks have as high a ceiling as the Sixers, which is weird to say when you have a superstar as great as Giannis Antetokounmpo on your roster. But I think the Bucks have just this cohesive mesh of talent that is just tantalizing, but also could be combustible in many ways too.
Yeah, you kind of just know what you're getting with the Bucks, where Philly, you just kind of don't know, but the potential is there. I mean, we haven't seen the best of Joel Embiid. We haven't seen the best of Ben Simmons, and we maybe haven't even seen the best of Tobias Harris and Richardson. So there's just a lot of potential to pop off, but obviously it is a risk because it is kind of a weird lineup. It's not something that's common in the NBA to go with such size and lack of shooting. So it could, combust, but it's kind of the storylines we'll be following all year. Any other thoughts on the Bucks, though, before we move on to League Pass?
Yeah, I think that the Bucks are always one of the teams to watch, and I think Giannis. It's insane that a kid who was a number 10 pick, I think, or at least a teens pick, could elevate himself into being the face of the league, and it's a wonderful story, and I like it when smaller market teams have relevancy. I want Giannis to stay in Milwaukee long term. I want them to be a franchise that I want to root for because, we all know about the Lakers. We all know about, the Patriots and the Manchester Uniteds, all those sort of teams. They're always going to have success because they have the cachet of being the marketability. They have that marketability factor. They have the location factor. Whereas if Giannis stays in Milwaukee long term, it could change. I'm not necessarily going to say it changes the way of the league because I think players drive the league and in terms of the optics around it, in terms of their own motivations. And I think Giannis is his own kettle of fish in a strange way. But there are so many things that can happen in such a short space of time. He could be on his way out. He's going to be a proud papa soon. He's going to have a second son outside of Ben Simmons. So that'll be fun as well. Hopefully he's a little bit nicer to him.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely fun to watch Antetokounmpo continue this rise to quote unquote take over the league or to be the next face of the league. And this Bucks team is, as you mentioned, it's fun seeing these mid-level to just medium market teams having success because we obviously always know, or at least generally speaking, we know that the Celtics, Lakers, Rockets, These big name cities tend to always be at the top of the conferences. They tend to be the teams we're talking about yearly getting stars and such. And the Bucks have become more and more relevant as they've had their own homegrown star in Antetokounmpo.
Very true. Now, how would you guys rate the Bucks on League Pass 1 through 10? Kory, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Jack?
Jack?
Jack's mic's muted. I'll go first.
Oh, just wait. Jack, you there?
Sorry. I'll give him an 8.5.
Okay, I'm just going to drop in it again so I can clean up that edit.
My bad. But yeah, my mic was muted.
No worries.
Blow my nose.
That would have been funny. All right. But how would you guys rate the Bucks on League Pass 1 through 10?
Yeah, I'm giving him an 8.5.
I'm giving them a 9. They have the reigning MVP who has the potential to be back-to-back MVP, as well as this is a team that will be competing for a title. I think if you're competing for a title and you actually have a true shot of winning a title, in my book, it grants you at least a 9, so I'm going to say 9.5.
I went with 8 here, and that's just because we've kind of already seen what we know with the Bucks, and I think there's also going to be a decent amount of blowouts with them. We saw Giannis didn't really even have to play a lot of fourth quarters last year, averaging close to 30 minutes. So, but what TV show would you guys compare to the Bucks?
Before we get to the TV show, I think Kory mentioned the storyline that we didn't even touch on. It's not that big of a storyline, but where would you guys have as, I know you haven't done your season previews and sort of overall league preview yet, but would you guys have Giannis as your MVP picks at this early point?
He was my pick. I got Antetokounmpo. I think it was my hot take. I have him winning Defensive Player of the Year and winning MVP next year.
Oh shit. Yeah, I think he's probably the favorite right now. I don't know if I'm ready to lock anybody in for MVP, but his situation is probably the most favorable, where he's not playing with somebody who's a really good number 2 star. Middleton's good, but he's not going to get that much pop, and his team's going to be really good. He's going to have the record to win the award, where other guys have that duo problem, and then the question would probably Steph Curry is, or Golden State going to win enough games?
And also, I think to start the year, especially with Bledsoe not being down, we're probably going to see a lot more Antetokounmpo till Bledsoe gets back. There won't, he'll have to, I think, play more minutes, at least early on, while they're trying to figure out the rotations for some of the guys they brought in. And before Bledsoe gets back, I think Antetokounmpo will have, a bigger workload, at least to start the year in particular.
Yeah, I think he's probably my second pick, but I'm almost a guy who likes the new shiny toys, or the old shiny toys who are vintage again, so Steph and Curry. So Steph has been my pick for quite a while in this postseason, just because I think that we forgot how good he was in 15, 16, 16, 17, and then obviously you had KD. So he's my pick, but I think if you have Giannis outside of your top 3 for MVP picks, you're silly, because they are going to be one of the best teams, and winning record does matter, outside of, Russell Westbrook and maybe 1 or 2 other occasions, you have to be one of the top teams in your conference to win the MVP. So I think it makes a lot of sense, and he's almost the safest pick, I think, Giannis.
Yeah, I think you look at the combination you need to win MVP. It's usually a great record. Usually need to be one of the top 5 players in the league, and then you put up a crazy stat line. The first 2 are already a given, and we're pretty much going to assume he's going to put up a crazy stat line again. So all the pieces are there for it to happen.
It's always harder to do back-to-back, though. So I think because there is, narrative fatigue, and that's sort of what I was sort of alluding to. So there is a mild narrative fatigue for me. People might be drawn more to James Harden if he's able to make things work with Russell Westbrook. Anthony Davis, is LeBron James going to hand the reins over to him despite having, that sprained thumb? Hopefully he's okay sooner rather than later. And then, if Stephen Curry can lead the Golden State Warriors to a top 4 seed and exceed people's expectations, then that narrative, and I've spoken about how important narrative is when it comes to the MVP race. When I did my article for the Hot Take Marathon on Kyrie Irving, narrative as well as stat line as well as team record matters quite a bit. And I think that Giannis, if he were to take a step and add some more post moves, doesn't necessarily have to add that 3-point shot, but if he adds some finesse to his offensive game outside of the power and raw athleticism that we saw, because in the postseason, he just needs to have a couple of maybe a skyhook or a back to the back sort of game to an extent. Or even if he does add the 3 ball, then you almost might as well give the MVP to him.
And also Kory's point, winning Defensive Player of the Year, if he was able to take not even a big step, just a solid step defensively, I think if you're dominating on both ends of the floor, that's going to open people's eyes a little bit more too. But what show would you guys compare to the Milwaukee Bucks, obviously based off of watchability or plot?
I went with Mad Men. It's one of the best, most accomplished shows in recent memory, thanks in large part due to the performance of one person, one actor, and in that case it was John Hamm as Don Draper. So I see similarities in terms of just the overall roster construction of the TV show that is Mad Men, one of the best dramas that we've seen in recent memory.
So I went with Breaking Bad. First off, watchability, like Breaking Bad is a really good show. I actually restarted watching it just because I watched the new movie that came out, El Camino, which is very good. I highly suggest. And so Walter White, right? In the first season, he starts off, obviously he gets cancer. And Austin Cooper doesn't have cancer. But he starts off.
I didn't even use that in the same line.
Where are we going here, Kory?
Let me clarify, because this is like the similarity. So Walter White's like a kind of like a weaker character. Like not like they make jokes that he's just not really a man. And then obviously he gets this alter life experience in which he becomes this tougher guy. And Antetokounmpo had those first couple of years where he was this really thin, like not a tough guy, and then he started to get tougher, meaner, more aggressive, and started to rise the NBA ranks. Walter White starts raising the drug ranks, and they become the face of a drug trade, the face of the NBA, and they continue to rise to power with like some questionable supporting cast, like Jesse Pinkman, like some hot and cold moments, like not the smartest of guys, Eric Bledsoe, not the greatest of 3-point shots. You got Mike, which is like kind of like a Middleton, like a good like wingman type of thing. But yeah, that's my comparison. Is
Giannis gonna betray Middleton?
Hopefully not. But the betrayal would be Antetokounmpo, wanting a trade out of Milwaukee. So I guess there's a possibility of a betrayal, but more or less it's that Antetokounmpo was this kind of soft-spoken little guy who has continued to progress to become one of the best at his craft.
I like it. It was well thought out.
That analysis was on point. I haven't heard as good a TV show comparison analysis over a whole series, and you guys have had to figure out 30 damn shows. So much respect, K-Wall.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'm not going to live up to that hype. I just went with Punisher here, and mostly on watchability, but obviously Punisher, savage. Same thing with Giannis. Punisher doesn't really have a lot of help. He's usually doing most of the work himself. Same thing with Giannis. So, but any other thoughts you guys want to touch on Milwaukee before we get out of here?
No, I think we've been able to delve quite deep and sort of address every single thing surrounding their sort of championship aspirations, Giannis, his contractual stuff, delving deep into Eric Bledsoe and Chris Middleton. I think that there are some lesser guys. I think Kory touched on Dante DiVincenzo. There are some young guys in terms of their rotation, Sterling Brown, DJ Wilson, these sort of guys that I think can maybe make this Bucks team better. Not necessarily to a large extent, but these sort of fringe guys can certainly help. And I think that matters in the regular season. And I think Bud did show that he was willing to go a little bit deeper into his rotation throughout the regular season and show some moments to guys like Sterling Brown and Pat Connaughton, these sort of guys. I really like Pat Connaughton as well. He's just crazy athletic. So there's a lot of guys in this roster that can certainly impact throughout the regular season.
DJ Wilson would be my pick if I had to guess out of which young guy took a jump this year. He showed some flashes, has a good body type. That'd be someone who could pop off. But as always, a pleasure talking hoops with you guys. Give yourself a shout out.
At the J-Man JBT, also co-host of Just Ball Things, and the Brooklyn Buzz.
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at KWallHoops, KWAL Hoops, and I am the host of the Full Access Hoops podcast, a part of the OTG Basketball Podcast Network.
Boom.
Make sure you follow those two. Also follow Off the Glass at OTG Basketball. Head to the website, otgbasketball.com. And like I mentioned earlier, you can find the shows on iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, Dash Radio, and YouTube.
Peace out, Knuckleheads.
There you go. You got it, son. Well done.